Hello, welcome to a video in which I, a medieval historian, answers the most popular questions from the internet about medieval history. So yeah, let's jump into the questions. The first question is, how did medieval people tell the time? Now, this is an interesting question because medieval people wouldn't have had the same perception of time as we do today. Obviously, in our very busy modern lives, we're always checking our phones, watches, constantly we have to know what time it is to be in certain places and doing certain things. For medieval people, this would be slightly different. Medieval people would have taken life a bit more slowly, and if they did need to know the time, they'd often do it by the sun, obviously waking up when the sun rises and going to bed normally when the sun sets. When they did need to know more specific times, this would probably be dictated by the church. So you've got the church times, so you've got Matins, Prime, Terces, Sext, None, Vespers, and Nocturnes. Those are the general church times, so medieval people might have used those to be a bit more specific with their timings, although for the most part they wouldn't have needed it. Next question. How did medieval people survive winter? So a lot of preparation would have gone into preparing yourself for winter. Obviously with cutting up logs ready to burn in the fire, you would have brought your animals into your houses with you. This wasn't just to keep your animals safe, but it was also for warmth. If you think about it, animals will give off heat, and if they've got them in a house or their sort of barn with them, it would then amplify the heat that's in the room available to you. Obviously this would have side effects, in which case you will have a very smelly house. But animals will be brought in. Obviously, if you want food throughout winter, you're not going to be getting the fresh things like berries if you forage them or anything like that. So you'd have to prepare your meats, and you do this by salting them, and then you can store them underground where they remain cool, and thus they won't go off. Obviously, it depended very much on what sort of class you are from in society. If you're from the lowest of the low, you're probably not going to be eating much meat. But if you're a king or a noble, you're going to be feasting all winter long, probably with huge fires, feasts galore. It's going to be a time to relax and grow that belly. Following on from this, how did medieval people keep warm? It's a good question. Medieval people would have kept warm in a variety of ways. Again, it depends very much on your social class. The richest of the rich would have had furs and things like that imported from the north, in which they could wear sort of these white furs from animals like lynx or ermine. And yeah, they'd be hugely expensive and a sign of your status, your wealth. Whereas the poorer people in society might use something like lambskin or even cats, the fur from cats. Obviously you don't want to be skinning your favourite cat, but it's what people did to survive. It would keep them warm, and it was done. Next question is, how did medieval battles work? It depends very much on the time and place of the battle. Obviously the medieval period is quite large. Obviously it starts off in what we call the early medieval period, and battles are very different then from when you get to later on with sort of what you'd imagine with the high medieval period or the high Middle Ages, where you've got lots of things like longbows, especially in England. So battles would be very changeable. Obviously with the early period, the early medieval period, you might get things like hit and run raids that are sort of done by the Vikings. They'd go from village to village raiding them, and they wouldn't really want a large scale battle. They'd sort of try and avoid it wherever possible. But when they did come into the sort of large-scale battles, they'd fight and they'd form the sort of shield walls and whatnot. And then as you progress through the Middle Ages, the armour changes a lot. So from the early medieval period, you're probably not going to have much protection against you. Whereas when you get later on, you've got these huge sort of breastplates and whatnot, and not just chainmail. The levies as such, their armour would not have changed too much over the course of the whole medieval period. The actual battles themselves in the medieval period would have been fairly gruesome and probably not what we're used to today. And again, it would have been extremely sweaty, especially if you imagine a sort of a huge amount of armour that you'd be wearing. You would get very tired very quickly, and so you'd often rotate. So it wouldn't just be this one line of people meeting an enemy. You might fight for a while and then sort of switch ranks, obviously depending on how many men you've got. The longer battles of the medieval period, for example, Hastings is recorded as probably one of the longest battles to happen. It lasts the entire day. Men would be rotating out and in, and obviously it's not necessarily a constant fight. In some fights you'll also have sort of breaks, especially when it's so big, and obviously depending on the terrain and things like that. I think one misconception that people get wrong about medieval battles sometimes is the fact that it was extremely dangerous for noblemen to fight. And whilst that is very much true of the earlier periods, in the later periods it becomes a little bit safer. Well, it's still obviously dangerous, but there would have been the reward for perhaps ransoms. So this would be where perhaps nobles from other sides, or even just the levies, the thanes, the knights, they would want to find a wealthy man, a wealthy opponent, who they could ransom. And this could obviously be huge for them. It could mean they'd never have to work a day in their life again. And it's sort of the get-rich-quick schemes of the Middle Ages. And there's even reports in some cases of men fighting each other and then taking the wounded man that they've just wounded, they've just stabbed or they've just injured, and taking them back behind the lines and trying to recover them because they know that they'd give a huge ransom. Okay, next question. How did medieval people shave or cut their hair? So most people would use any kind of blade of some kind, obviously as we do today. They wouldn't have had the razors that we have, but most people would have had a sort of common knife. Combine that with a bit of water. You wouldn't necessarily have had sort of a shaving cream or anything like that, but you just use a knife and you would just shaved like that. Some people would, for stubble and things like that, you could use pumice stones, and that would just rub against your face and that would grind off the stubble. Cutting your hair can be done in various ways. You could either just take a knife to it and sort of just rub at it, and eventually it'll come off when you cut through. It wouldn't look very nice, but it would be one way to get it done. Another way would be with shears, but that's not to say that everyone did cut their hair. I mean, one of the royal dynasties of France, the Merovingians, they absolutely would not cut their hair. They grew it out, and it was sort of a status symbol, because if they were caught and captured, they would cut people's hair off. And so having a full head of hair was a sign that you hadn't been captured and you were a strong sort of fighting figure. They would prefer to grow their hair long. Okay, let's move on to the who questions rather than we've done a few hows. What about the who's? So who were the serfs in the Middle Ages? So I think one thing that people get wrong sometimes is assuming that serfs and slaves were the same thing, which is not true. So serfs had, they worked for a lord of the manor, essentially. I think it is difficult to bring in this sort of traditional idea of feudalism today, because I think that oversimplifies medieval society, really. But serfs would basically be near the bottom of the chain, pretty much, the sort of chain of society. But yeah, they would work the land for the lord of the manor, and in return, they would be able to farm their own plots of land, and that would be used for their subsistence. So in most cases, serfs worked the fields, but obviously they could work in various other capacities, whether that's in forests, cutting down lumber, or down mines, extracting ores and things like that. They would do various jobs depending on the needs of their lords. Who were knights in the Middle Ages? Good question. I feel like knights occupy this sort of middle ground in this sort of traditional idea of a feudal hierarchy. So there'd be 3 tiers down. You have the king at the top, then you've got the nobles, who's sort of most important men, and then you've got the knights. And these would be men who would have landed estates, and they would fight for the king in times of need. They would have enough sort of money and wealth to be able to be trained as a professional soldier. So compared to normal levies, who would be basically just run-of-the-mill people who would have no military experience, if you grew up in these estates, you had to have time to practice and hone your craft in things like sword fighting and hand-to-hand combat. In fact, knights were in a very good position for social mobility, and I think this is one thing that people get wrong about the Middle Ages. They sort of assume that people assume there's like a feudal hierarchy and it's set in stone, but that's not the case. So if we take probably one of the most successful knights of the Middle Ages, there was a man called William Marshall, and he was knighted in 1166. He was the son of a very minor noble, but he wasn't the eldest son, so he wasn't in line to inherit that position. So he had to make a name for himself his own way, and he did this through knightly tournaments. So he would go off and fight in these tourneys, and he was incredibly successful at this, and he gained renown, so much so that by 1189, he was able to marry a woman named Isabel de Clare. Now, Isabel was an incredibly important figure. Her father was the Earl of Pembroke, and this meant he was pretty much at the top of the chain of society. Only a sort of the king was above him, so he would be in the earls. At this point, dukes weren't invented, and dukes would go on to become a bit more important. From 1189, he becomes the sort of de facto Earl of Pembroke, and by 1199, he's actually granted the earldom himself, which means he's risen up from this sort of position of the youngest son of a minor noble as a knight to becoming earl. And not only that, in 1216, after the death of King John, William actually rises even further. He becomes regent. He becomes pretty much the most important man in England, as he's regent for Henry III. Now that is one hell of a rise, don't you think? Who was Charlemagne in the Middle Ages? We talked a bit about important figures, but Charlemagne is probably considered to be one of the most seminal figures in the entirety of, I guess, European history for that matter. He was first king of the Franks and king of the Lombards, and eventually became Holy Roman Emperor he was actually crowned on Christmas Day in the year 800. He's seen as a bit of the father of Europe, so the lands that he occupied sort of makes up what is now modern-day France, parts of Germany, parts of Italy. He had this huge realm, and he defended the papacy, he defended the Pope, and in return I think that's why Pope Leo III crowned him Holy Roman Emperor. It was sort of a revival of that Roman past, but in a new way. Obviously the Holy Roman Empire stretches all the way through into what is now known as, I suppose, it's the modern period. Who are monks in the Middle Ages? So monks, along with nuns, sort of the female counterpart, they're religious figures mainly that lived in monasteries. The monasteries were important for a number of different reasons, namely carrying out scholarship. So some of the most important pieces of history we have from the medieval period actually date back to monasteries. So if you think about the Venerable Bede, Bede was writing in the north, in Yarrow, and he writes his Ecclesiastical History of the English Peoples, which is one of the earliest and best accounts we have of medieval people in early medieval Britain in England, which is an incredible piece of work. Highly recommend you read it. But in addition to scholarship, they were also important in secular life too. So not only did they do stuff for the religious side of things, but they were also a place where travellers could stop off when they were on pilgrimage or just travelling by. They would be given food and lodgings, and they also acted as the sort of medieval equivalent of a hospital. So if you were in need of care or aid, you would take them to the local monastery and they'd be taken care of. And obviously in monasteries, the most important figures would have been the abbots or the abbesses. And these figures would have not only had roles in religious things, but they would have also helped advising rulers like the kings. They would have given them spiritual advice, as well as secular advice as well. It's one thing I suppose is often overlooked. Monks themselves could have done various different things. They would often live in various different ways. Some would have taken up the life of being a hermit and sort of replicating the lives of different saints, for example, Saint Anthony. Others would take vows of poverty. The Dominicans and the Franciscans were famous for that. Some would become itinerant and go preach the word of God. Others, perhaps the more bold of them, would go off and become missionaries and go off to far-flung places where Christianity had not yet reached. Who was the king in the Middle Ages? Okay, this is an interesting question. Obviously, there were many kings in the Middle Ages. There's not just one. Again, it depends on the time and place in which you're looking at. And this changed a great deal. King's son, or some kings were obviously more well-known than others. In England, for example, Alfred the Great and William the Conqueror might spring to mind more readily than someone like Ethelred the Unready. That's not to say they're not as interesting. In fact, some of the more interesting kings are the ones you don't really know about until you actually dive into it and look into them. And I wouldn't even just limit that to kings. Go and look into queenship and women who are ruling it and in these positions of power. Perhaps one of the most interesting cases I find is looking into Ethelfled, Lady of the Mercians. Now, she was a medieval ruler, ruled in the Kingdom of Mercia, which saw the Midlands in England today. And the only case of a woman passing the throne to another woman happens during this period. Ethelfled passes the kingdom to her daughter, Elfwin. Incredibly interesting bit of history. A final who? Who were the merchants of the Middle Ages? So this is probably the most overlooked class of people in the whole Middle Ages, and perhaps the most fascinating, especially for me. I think they provide some of the most interesting evidence, especially with in terms of archaeological evidence as well. But they would be the traders, the people who would sell things where you'd buy exotic goods from. And not all of them would have been exotic. Most of them would have been just the sort of market traders. They would have just operated between localities in small towns and villages. But there was definitely a few that would go off on these huge, incredible adventures and go to the most far-flung places. And we have evidence of these hugely remote pieces of goods and jewellery and coinage coming from the most remote places in the world. One of my favourites is one that's detailed really, really well by Kat Jarman, who found a carnelian bead in a hoard from the Great Viking Army in England. Now, this carnelian bead can be traced back to India. How incredible is that? You're telling me there's this bead in the sort of the 800s that has come from India, and that to me is amazing. Further examples, you look at like Viking Age hoards of coins, and these dirhams, they come from Central Asia, these mints in Central Asia, and they turn up all over Europe, mainly through like the Vikings, who obviously would spread them all across sort of Scandinavia, and then from there they would sort of come out. And they weren't used as what we'd sort of deem as coins today. They were used mainly for their silver content, the sort of the bullion economy. But they're incredibly interesting, and the merchants would have been these people that would have moved these goods along these highways. For example, like the Silk Road, probably the most well-known of these trading highways. Next question, why did medieval houses overhang? Everyone's probably seen the classic image of the overhanging medieval houses. They look a bit strange when you first come across them, because you're like, well, why would they overhang? Surely you would just build straight up. But it actually makes perfect sense why they do overhang when you actually look into it. So the reason is, it's basically to do with weight. So if you're imagining these houses are built out of wood like this, if you built them straight up on top of each other, the wood would start bending in, sort of curving in, especially when you start placing furniture in the rooms and you start standing in them, it would start bending and flexing, and you don't really want that. So when you build the walls out like this, and you put on your roof, your second floor, if you overshoot it slightly, you make it overhang, then suddenly you've got a counterbalance, and the weight balance is on the other side. So when you put something like the wall on top of it, that acts as a weight. So when you're standing on the middle, you've got this basically support with the wall, and it basically stops it from bending inwards and snapping in on itself. Next question, why did medieval times end? So I think there's a common misconception that is probably in part due to the historian, and the fact that the medieval period didn't just end. It wasn't like, bam, it's over. It was sort of a gradual process in which mainly the historians go, this was the medieval period, this was the Renaissance. But we do have a date, if you want a sort of solid date. In England especially, the Middle Ages usually tends to be ascribed as ending in 1485, after the death of Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth. Now, I'm not entirely happy with that as a sort of end date. I think maybe that can be ascribed as the first part of the end of the Middle Ages, but then you start getting this rebirth, this Renaissance period coming through, and it starts down in Italy with the revival, the rediscovery of ancient texts, the sort of the Romans and the Greeks and their knowledge. But basically, how I would assume the end of the Middle Ages to go is, I'd say the Middle Ages starts ending at Bosworth, 1485, And I'd almost say it goes on until the start of the reign of Elizabeth I in about 1558, which is a fairly long period of time, but obviously these things take a while to change and slowly progress. So I'd say the Middle Ages sort of ends somewhere in amongst that, in that pile. Why did medieval people sleep twice? So medieval people would use what we call a biphasic sleeping pattern. Obviously this means sleeping twice. So you'd have your first sleep and your second sleep. Your first sleep, you'd normally go to bed roughly when the sun sets, and you'd sleep in probably till 11 p.m, midnight. And then you'd get up and you'd do things for a few hours. Now, the things that people did varied considerably based on time and places and the actual people. But you might have done things like house chores, you might have been tidying up, you might have been preparing things for the next day. You might have gone and checked on your animals. You might go and spend some time socialising with friends. You might spend some time for intimate relations with your partner. And then after that, you would have your second sleep. I also forgot to say, it might be a time to pray. Praying would have obviously been a good use of a medieval person's time. Leading on from this, why did medieval people sleep sitting up? So I think the idea of people sleeping in a sort of upright position is associated with the devil, and this idea that if you're sleeping lying down in this sort of flat position, the angel of death, so to speak, would come in and see you and think you're dead and take away your soul from your body. And then you would be dead when you woke up, because you wouldn't wake up. So the idea was that if you slept in a sort of upright position, if the angel of death came along, they would see you and go, well, they must just be resting. So perhaps a strange superstition, but this might be a reason why you see some of the beds and they might be a bit shorter. Obviously people were shorter back then, on average anyway. Why did medieval monks have that haircut? Great question. Obviously everyone's probably seen the image of a monk with what we call a tonsure. That's the haircut they have, and it varies actually in different places. So the Celtic tonsure sort of goes over the top of the head like this, in a sort of band, whereas the normal tonsure you see goes around in a band like that, and it varies in different places. But monks would normally do this as a sign of humility, and it was also to do with religious devotion, the fact that you were willing to sacrifice, I suppose, how you looked, because people still cared about that sort of thing back in the day. So if you're willing to sacrifice that, it really showed how much you're willing to devote your life to God. It's also a sign of a status in your position within the church. If you were tonsured, you would be given different rights within the church compared to those who hadn't been through their training, hadn't got the tonsure. And yeah, monks saw it as a sign of pride, and something that they took very seriously. If you like this and want a part 2, then make sure you subscribe for more, and I'll catch you in the next video. Goodbye.